Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the launch of our new NGLCC Crossroads and Conversation series. My name is Alicia Green. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the Director of Supplier Diversity here at NGLCC. Along with my colleague, Sean Franklin, I also oversee our Communities of Color initiative. I am so excited that this inaugural program is being held in conjunction with the Communities of Color initiative. And Sean and I will be back towards the end of the program to take any questions from the audience for today's guest speaker, Jonathan Capehart. So be sure to type any questions that you have in the chat box below. It is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's program, NGLCC co-founder and president, Justin Nelson.
Hey, Alicia, thank you so much. And congratulations on your promotion to Director of Supplier Diversity yesterday, well-deserved. So we're thrilled to have you in that role. I want to welcome you all to this inaugural edition of our new Crossroads and Conversation series. We're really pleased to be doing this in conjunction with our Communities of Color initiative. But over the next many months, you'll be hearing from top corporate executives, newsmakers, glass-shattering suppliers, and just anyone that we want to share their perspective on the goings-on of the moment and that we feel can bring real value to the NGLCC stakeholder community. It is my pleasure to kick this off with our good friend, Jonathan Capehart. Before we do that, I just want to share a couple of housekeeping items. Today's conversation is meant to educate, I hope at times entertain. It will be uncomfortable for some, very comfortable for others, but we want to get to the heart of the matter. We want to have an authentic conversation with Jonathan, gain his perspective as a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and hopefully continue to move this dialogue forward. NGLCC started our Communities of Color initiative last year because we didn't feel we had done enough to ensure that every LGBT person, no matter of where you were from, the color of your skin, no matter whether you were gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered, man, woman, non-binary, a person of color, a veteran, disabled, anyone that is a part of our allied or LGBT, anyone that's a part of our stakeholder group knew that NGLCC was a home for them. And so over the last year plus, we've been doing a lot of programming, obviously heightened by the horrible events surrounding the death of George Floyd and the ensuing protests that have swept across our country, demanding real change in the fight against racism and racial violence. So I sit here today well aware of my white privilege and my male privilege. We're turning the tables a little bit on Jonathan. Today, he is going to be the interviewee, not the interviewer. And it is my job to listen, to learn, and to come out of this the best advocate I can be. And I hope that those of you that have tuned in today will do the same. So with that as our backdrop, it is my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker. In 1999, as an editorial writer, then at the New York Daily News, Jonathan won a Pulitzer Prize for his editorial writing during his 16-month campaign to save the famed Apollo Theater in Harlem. In 2001, he left to become an advisor on Michael Bloomberg's first successful campaign for mayor, after which he returned to the Daily News, then spent some time in the private sector, and now serves as an opinion writer and editorial board member at the Washington Post. Many of you have seen Jonathan in his regular duties as a commentator for MSNBC. He was named an esteemed honoree in 2011. It's a distinction given to individuals in their recognition for their efforts in supporting the African American and LGBT communities in the areas of entertainment, media, civil rights, business, and art. In 2014, The Advocate magazine ranked Jonathan 9th out of 50 of the most influential LGBT people in media. Mediate.com has named him as one of the top 9 rising stars of cable news. In May of 2018, the publisher of the Washington Post awarded him an Outstanding Contribution Award for his opinion writing and the Cape Up podcast interviews, one of which in particular I want to talk about, and we'll get to that today. He holds a BA in political science from the Carleton College, and he is married to his husband, Nick. I believe that happened in 2017, and they reside here in Washington, D.C. So it is my pleasure to introduce to all of you our friend, Jonathan Capehart. Welcome.
Sorry about that. You would think that after all this time, I would know how to actually operate this Zoom thing. But thank you very much, Justin. As I was saying when I was muted, I feel very exposed after your long biographical introduction. But thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to be a part of this inaugural effort. You of all people know just how special NGLCC is to me and how much fun it is to host the best of the best event every year here in Washington. And, you know, I get involved not only because of you and Chance, but also because of what NGLCC does in terms of bringing together diverse organizations and communities. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, awesome. Well, thanks. Well, let's dive right in. I think we've got a lot to cover in a short amount of time. Obviously, I would not be doing my job if I did not kick things off with a question about Joe Biden's choice of Kamala Harris to run on the presidential ticket with him. What does that mean to you? What did it mean? How are you planning on covering that? Just tell us what's going on in your world with regards to this.
Oh, so a spectacular decision. At the beginning of the presidential race, I said Kamala Harris was the person who should be the nominee. But then once Joe Biden was in, it was like, no one is going to get support from the African-American community as long as Joe Biden is in the race. Senator Harris dropped out in December, and almost immediately I was like, well, she's VP. Like she will be the vice presidential pick. And then in May of this year, I wrote a two-part column series. One was Biden needs a Black woman as VP, and then I laid out the case, not just because, oh, let's just have a Black woman on the ticket, but here's why. People talk about all the time, particularly folks in my business, about how, oh, the Democratic Party lost the forgotten voter, and that if they can only win back those disaffected white voters, everything would be all right. And no, that was not true. And so the focus was always on Democrats need to win back Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And that always bothered me because the focus was always white voters and not focusing it in on the fact that if Hillary Clinton had gone to Wisconsin, gone to Michigan, she was in Pennsylvania a lot, but people forget there are Black people in Detroit, Black people in Milwaukee, Black people in Philadelphia. And I show what happened in those states in terms of voter turnout. And I'll just point out Michigan. Hillary Clinton lost Michigan by 10,721 votes. The amount of Black vote that didn't show up between 2012 and 2016 was 50,000, 50. If Hillary Clinton had gone to Michigan and gone to Detroit, maybe she could have closed that gap. But the point I was making was, if the Democratic Party and the Democratic Party nominee and Joe Biden focused on turning out the bedrock base of the Democratic Party, that he would stand a chance of snatching back Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Then the second piece, after I made the case for a Black woman, because he'd already said he was going to select a woman, I then laid out the case for, at the time, the 4 Black women who were most talked about: Stacey Abrams of Georgia, Val Demings of Florida, Kamala Harris of California, and Susan Rice of Washington, D.C. And I walked through each one of them and why they were being considered and why people were talking about them. But in the end, I said Kamala Harris was the person who should be the pick. And primarily because, you know, she had run for elective office. statewide California 3 times. She has her Washington experience in terms of the House, Senate Intelligence Committee, Senate Judiciary Committee. But the most important quality that she had, leave aside policy and dynamics on the campaign trail, the most important thing she had going for her, I think, is that, well, actually on the debate stage, she went after Joe Biden. People criticized her for it. I knocked her for it because it was a sugar high that in the end did not last in terms of polling. And then as it had become clear even before then, people who attacked Joe Biden disappeared very quickly. Congressman Swalwell was in and out of that race after he attacked Mayor Pete. Kirsten Gillibrand was out of the race after she attacked Joe Biden. Senator Harris eventually was out of the race, but her poll numbers started sliding within a couple of weeks after attacking Vice President Biden on busing. But the point was, Democrats didn't want Democrats fighting each other. They wanted the focus to be on Trump. And by taking that shot, Joe Biden learned that Kamala Harris was willing to fight. She was a fighter. She was not expecting this to be anything to be handed to her. And I think that what Senator Harris learned in the aftermath of taking that shot was that sometimes some shots are better left not taken. And you put in, the relationship with Biden's late son, Beau, and a whole bunch of other factors. And it just became clear. It was obvious she was the perfect pick. And as I've been saying over the last 24 hours, we folks who aren't politicians, we're so used to politicians not doing the common sense thing. We're so used to politicians making things oh so complicated and putting their fingers in the wind and trying to figure out where we are. And then the decisions that they make almost always have us like, what are you doing? So that when a politician actually, takes the common sense step, we're all like, oh my God, he actually did it. Like the politician actually did it. And I think that is part of the reason why there's so much enthusiasm out there for her as VP and for this ticket in general.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think a number of people felt that same question when the attack came in the debate.
Sorry about that.
I think those same people are now saying, you know what, if she can bring it to Biden, she can bring it to anybody. And I can tell you, in almost every conversation I had from the moment that debate happened until, this morning when I've been talking with people about it, that's one thing that people say. She is tenacious, she is strong, and she is going to be able to be the kind of vice presidential nominee that will take it to the opponent. And in fact, you bring up Trump. Very interesting that a week or so ago he had mentioned he thought it was a good choice, and then when she's named, she's nasty, sort of the same vernacular he slips into when he's talking about women in general. What sort of a dynamic do you see playing out with regard to that particular back and forth between the candidates?
Oh, sure. So this gets to another one of the reasons why I said she should be the pick. She is not afraid of Donald Trump. He factors nowhere in terms of what the America she believes in looks like. So he is not on any kind of pedestal to her. She, as we have seen in the hearings with Jeff Sessions, with Bill Barr, with Brett Kavanaugh, she comes to those hearings fully prepared. You see, like, the prosecutor hat comes on immediately, and she doesn't suffer fools. One, because she's like, there's a clock in front of her ticking down how much time she has, but also she has a theory of the case and she has a goal that she's trying to reach. The role of the vice presidential nominee is to be the presidential nominee's pit bull, and that is exactly what she's going to be. But also, and I think this is what's going to lend power to her role on the ticket, the two of them are in the right. And I say that like thinking of the way Republicans used to talk about the Constitution and the country and the presidency. And so when you have Biden Harris going up against Trump Pence and everything that they have done in their 3.5 years in office, if you're Kamala Harris, why wouldn't you feel comfortable in your own skin taking it right to President Trump, taking it right to Vice President Pence, and make them stand in the truth that's being hurled at them? And then to watch her sit back as she and the American people watch how they respond. I am curious. I will be very curious to see how they respond to Biden Harris. So far, and they've already responded. And as you said, President Trump's response has been nothing but a recitation of things we've heard before. So they don't have the same power. One thing, this is what I wanted to say in the previous answer that applies here. I have long believed that President Trump was afraid of Kamala Harris. When she was running for president, I remember asking her, it turned out about a week before she dropped out of the race, like, are you afraid of President Trump? And she said, no, but he should be afraid of me. And it was it was fantastic. But I asked that question because up until recently, there were only 2 people in Washington to whom he did not give a terrible nickname. One was Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, and she has one now. So the only person left is Kamala Harris. Think about it. There's no nasty nickname for Kamala Harris. I mean, he called her nasty, but that's an adjective. He has not given her any kind of nickname, and certainly not the racist nickname that he, keeps hurling out there, as he did last night about Senator Elizabeth Warren. And so, Kamala Harris, from her perspective, she's like, I don't care. Call me whatever you want. Let's have this debate. I'm ready.
It's interesting from your vantage point. I mean, you've had I guess you could call it a luxury, the honor of being able to be across the table from a number of iconic leaders. And one of the things we wanted to explore in today's conversation just is the state of race relations, the state of, how do we keep the energy alive and moving towards real structural change? And we suffered a great loss last month with the passing of John Lewis. And I think the editorial that you wrote was probably one of the best commemorations of his life service that I have seen. And of course it should be, you're a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, but just everything that encapsulated, that he encapsulated well beyond just John Lewis the man. What was it like when he passed? What was going on in your mind, given everything else in the world that was happening at that moment?
So unbeknownst to, I think, anybody who's watching right now, the week before he died, we were in the middle of a John Lewis fire drill. I was out on a walk heading towards the Jefferson Memorial when my phone buzzed, and I looked down and there was a text message from a source that said, I'm hearing John Lewis passed away. What are you hearing? And I was so jarred, I had to stop. And I was looking and seeing other text messages. And then I started calling other sources to try to find out. And I started cutting my walk short to get back home because I knew I would have to write something. And within about 15 minutes, I got a response directly from the congressman's office saying, he is not dead. He is resting comfortably, which to me, whenever you hear anyone say someone's resting comfortably, who's fighting stage 4 pancreatic cancer, to me that signaled, okay, he's not gone, but it's a matter of time. So I continued on my walk, and was, happy when 24 hours became 48 hours, became, it kept ticking along. Primarily because I was trying to figure out, what am I going to say about this person who I'd written about so often, and had written about just, I think at that point, only 2 weeks earlier, when he went to Black Lives Matter Plaza, and I was there to witness that. And I wrote a piece that even at the moment felt like a eulogy, particularly because the interview I did with him for my podcast, the final question was, what do you tell this generation of activists who are just getting involved, and they're young, and they're the age now that you were when you were on the Edmund Pettus Bridge and doing the lunch counters and doing the freedom rides, and you've been through disappointments and setbacks. What do you tell them? And he had this beautiful quote where he said, you have to push until you have to give until you can give no more, and you have an obligation to leave the planet better than when you found it. I mean, what do I do? How can I write about this person after having just done that? So a week later, the text messages started coming in on a Friday night, and I had gotten word that it was not true. I went to bed safe in the knowledge, and then my husband woke me up at about 1:30 in the morning and said, John Lewis passed away. And then I looked at my phone, and 20 minutes after I went to sleep was when the messages were coming in saying, he's gone, he's passed away. And I wrote something rather quickly, in the sense that I was trying to figure out what new thing can I say that I didn't already put in that previous piece. I ended the two pieces in the same way, thinking that probably a lot of people didn't see that first piece I wrote anyway. And so just used it as an opportunity to use that quote I mentioned before again. But, John Lewis, and I shed a lot of tears actually live on television, because people don't understand. I'd say to people, imagine a hero of yours, and you get a chance to meet that person, and not just one time, but several times, and they get to know your name and you get to know them. But when it's John Lewis, he is, as John Meacham, the historian, calls him, an American saint, or at the time I viewed him as an angel. Like, who would turn down the opportunity to sit with an angel? When someone asks, why would you interview this man so many times? And you walk the Edmund Pettus Bridge with this person, and you realize, were it not for his actions and the actions of the nearly 600 people who tried to walk across that bridge that day, were it not for their actions, would I be here right now? Would I have the life that I have? Would African Americans, even though things are not by all means not perfect, but would we still have, be living in segregation, like state-sanctioned segregation? And so to be able to look at this person and see that because of him and that whole generation, that I'm here and I get to report on him and I get to talk about him. I mean, it's such a hard thing. It's such a hard thing to articulate. But then when he passed away, I was sad, because it was sad as if I'd lost an intimate family member, when really we were just sort of casual friends. Someone I'd interviewed. But then you realize, and then this is what made me cry on camera more than once, is just the importance of this person, who was such a good person and such a decent person, but also, and this is what I think gave him enormous power, such a humble person, really a humble person. who had such an impact on this country, not just on my life, but on this country, was to have that connection is I was going back and looking through old pictures. I have so many pictures from trips to Selma and Montgomery, Memphis, with Congressman Lewis, and walking in the footsteps with Lewis and just other people who weren't as renowned as Congressman Lewis, but who were there that day. Like I know I'm rambling on, but I'm still sort of in awe of the fact that I got to share some time and space with a person who, you know, if it would be great if Pope Francis or whoever his successor is actually names him a saint, because that's exactly who John Lewis was.
Let's go back, several months before the congressman passed, to the day that George Floyd was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
What was going through your mind at that point? And with the knowledge that that was the most recent of a history's long attacks on Black men and women by some very bad actors within the police force. And sort of secondarily to that, what is your thought on how that ballooned into what has happened up until this point?
So the killing of George Floyd, well, let me even take a further step back. I had stopped watching what I dubbed black male murder porn a few years ago. It had become so traumatic that I could not bear to watch yet another Black person be killed on video. As thankful as I am that those videos exist, because it showed people, particularly white people, that what we had been talking about for generations were not exaggerations, figments of our imagination, but real. But I couldn't do it. And when people were talking about this George Floyd video, the first one that came out with him on the ground and the police officer's knee on his neck, I watched maybe 15 seconds of it, and then I had to stop. It was too hard. And also coming after the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, where he was running. I mean, Justin, I don't run anymore. I walk briskly in my advanced age, but Ahmaud Arbery was killed doing what I did, not that I did it unthinking, but that I did as part of a daily routine. This idea that, living while Black puts you in danger. And so,
those things like today, when you were out and you got your text message from a source or another journalist that said, hey, this is what when you're out and about, is that something that you fear every day?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. Before Ahmaud Arbery, before, oh my God, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name in Minneapolis, George Floyd. Sure, absolutely. Even before, it all started with Trayvon Martin and the idea that a kid, 17 years old, walking back to his father's girlfriend's apartment with iced tea and Skittles, talking on the phone with a friend, could be killed, viewed as suspicious. And that is something that every African-American has to deal with, particularly African-American men. And so, fast forward to George Floyd, by the time that video came out, I was just worn out, completely worn out. I think the reason why George Floyd's video sparked a international movement is because it was so gruesome. People watched a man die in real time, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Folks watched that. And there was no denying what was happening. And I think sort of the nonchalant nature of the police officer with his hands in his pockets while he has his knee on his neck, and then the other officers also on their knees on his back going down his body. How do you watch that and not hear the screams and pleas and cries of other people who had been in similar situations, or listen to other Black people who say, this is what we've been talking about. This is why we've been afraid. The allegation against George Floyd was that he might have passed a counterfeit $20 bill. Ahmaud Arbery was just jogging. Tamir Rice, 12, was playing with a toy gun in a public park. There was the woman who was at Yale, who had the campus police called on her because she fell asleep while studying. How is that different from what anybody does when you're in college and sleeping and studying? It is truly, it's scary. And I think what also, between the video of George Floyd and what is happening in the White House and the racism and xenophobia and homophobia and transphobia, just the hate coming out of the White House and this administration just sort of, I think, fueled this passion to say, okay, like, we've had it. Enough of this. And, you know, it's one thing to have African Americans take to the streets. I mean, let's not forget that the demonstrations that have been brought under the umbrella of Black Lives Matter took off after the killing of Michael Brown, and, you know, kept going in Ferguson for more than 400 days and didn't really go away, but then blew up again after the killing of George Floyd. But what made this different was the number of white people who came out into the streets to demonstrate and to be allies. And that began a whole wider conversation that I'm glad went beyond police brutality and police killings of unarmed African Americans to the larger issues of just the hell Black people go through just to be in the United States, just to be able to, like, live their lives, and the kinds of armor that we have to put on to withstand things that we now know as microaggressions to things that are flat out violent. And we are all on edge and looking and making sure that we are safe. I mean, I laugh at my husband, who, you know, says sometimes, you're never aware of your surroundings. You just sort of la, la, la. And it's like, not true.
Yeah, I know Nick.
Yes, it's like, not true. I am very well aware of my surroundings because I have no choice not to be. I have to be.
Well, you know, protocol was his thing. So he's just wanting to make sure you're following proper protocol for your surroundings.
Yeah, yeah.
You raise a good point that bringing white people out in support of protest was a pivotal moment. I think for so many, and I can speak for myself, you know, we want to be an ally here. We want to do things right. And you do go back in your own mind and think about things that you have done or said, or experiences where you should have stood up and said, stop it. You know, that's not appropriate. I think people also need to be able to forgive themselves for shortcomings, but we're also looking for tools to be adequate accurate, informed, and impactful right now, I'm sure there are things that we should do and things that we shouldn't be doing. And as just maybe basic as it sounds, from a gay black man to a gay white man, what can I do to be better at being an advocate for the Black community?
Well, I mean, NGLCC is part of it, like bringing people in, establishing the relationships. But you asked for you personally, just, I mean, there's so many things, and they range from the tiny to the big. I'll start with the big. When you hear something, see something, either on social media that's bigoted or what have you, or if you're out in public and you hear someone say something derogatory to someone else, especially when the someone else is, you know, minding their own business, stand up, say something. Those are the moments when a person of color who is catching hell from someone else, particularly someone white, where we're so accustomed to just fighting the fight alone, because no one's going to stand up and say, I'm here, I have your back. And I think that's why you saw so much sort of gasping reaction among African Americans about, oh my God, look at all the white people who are here. And it's because we're not used to that. The key, though, is to keep doing it once the television cameras go away, once the national attention moves to something else. Because as we all know, racism and hate, it's like a lawn. You have to constantly cut it back. You have to constantly monitor and make sure that it doesn't get out of control. So speaking up when someone is being attacked. But I think if you want a good first step, reach out and start establishing a relationship. Say there's a person of color in your office or a Black person in your office who you see every day, but the relationship doesn't go beyond good morning, if it's even that. But you have a cordial relationship, start talking. And it doesn't have to be, hey, I want to talk to you about race today. No, the racial conversations really take off when there are two people of goodwill who know each other well enough to understand the motivations behind the questions being asked, and then can move from there. I mean, Justin, I would hope that, you know, we've known each other long enough that if you had a question where you're like, you know what, I'm not sure if I'm thinking about this in the right way, meaning, are my eyes open wide enough to understand what's happening, that you could call me and say, like, hey, listen, I need to sound you out on something. It's about a conversation. And I think, you know, for African Americans, the ones who I've spoken to, and I'm not going to sit here and try to be the ambassador of Blackness, but I remember writing a piece about reparations. And there are a lot of African Americans who are like, damn it, I want my check, I want my money, you know, America owes this to us. And I get that. And in the piece, I said, you know, actually, I bet what African Americans deep down would like to get from the United States government is an apology. And that's not that would be the be all and end all, but what does an apology do? An apology is a recognition of pain and hurt and wrong. And for 401 years, we have not gotten an apology for, well, everything. But imagine if you had a president of the United States who went, you know, an Oval Office address and said, on behalf of the people of the United States, I apologize for slavery and Jim Crow and all of the things that happened. Now, that's just one piece. There's so much more that has to be done. But I think a lot of like, think of the times when you've been hurt, like grievously hurt, and the person who did it hasn't even acknowledged it, hasn't apologized. But the person who does apologize when they've hurt you, you may or may not forgive, but you give them props for having the guts, for having the guts to step up and say, you know what, I did that, and I'm sorry.
You know, it makes me think too, you're not born racist. You're raised racist. You're influenced to be racist, and people can change that prerogative. I think I was listening to your podcast, Capehart, and I was really intrigued by the conversation with Derek Black, who was going to be the heir apparent to the white nationalist movement. And in fact, if I've got it right, I think David Duke was even his
godfather.
Yeah, exactly. I'd be interested. I don't. If everyone hasn't listened to the podcast, you absolutely should. But for those that haven't heard it, can you share a little bit about what that dialogue was like, and some of the information that you pulled out from Derek during that conversation?
So you have to understand that that's the second time I've done a podcast related to Derek. The first time, it was a podcast actually with my post colleague Eli Saslow, who wrote a book out of hatred. And it was all about Derek's journey from being basically the JFK Jr. of white nationalism to, escaping and now becoming a big anti-racist out there sounding the alarm about what's happening with this administration. And I was just, in reading Eli's book, who is a beautiful, beautiful writer, here you are reading about this white nationalist, this young white nationalist, and reading about his journey from, hanging out with some really scary people to being in college and being surrounded by the very people he was preaching hate against, and then watching or reading as he is pulled out of the darkness by a woman who is now his wife. And she did it in a way where she didn't do it on emotion. She realized that he was very analytical, and she went to him with all sorts of studies that disproved every racist notion that he had. And I think it was because of her persistence and because of his openness and curiosity and intelligence, that he was able to see that what he was espousing was not true and was actually harmful. And he's also very humble about who he is and how far he's traveled. And in the podcast, you'll hear him. He struggles with the fact that this is part of his history. And I think at one point he says, I'm not looking for accolades and I'm not looking for applause. Basically, he's looking to, in his own way, try to make things right. And so, when you listen to that podcast, he's comes from the world of that extreme. And that extreme that we're seeing out of the Trump administration and the president in his coddling of white supremacists, actually having them on his staff, white nationalists. The podcast I thought you were going to mention was the one with Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility. That was the one, that book, I read it last year, and I'd been raving about it since I read it. I read White Fragility and then White Rage back to back. And then if you want a third recommendation, Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl. White Rage is written by Carol Anderson. But Robin DiAngelo, what I loved about her book, and then if anyone who's watching this right now has not read it, and I know there's criticism about her book, But what I loved about her book is that it's a white woman writing to white people about racism and white privilege. And the fact that, Justin, I thought of this, Justin, because you said, no one is born racist, it's taught. And that's Robin's whole book about how, white people need to understand that whether you're rich or poor, you are born into a system that it's everywhere. Yeah. And even if you view yourself as a good liberal who, understands the plights and, is there and is an ally, that even you too need to be open to the fact that, you have bias and that you need to check it. And I think that is one of the reasons why her book rocketed up to number one on bestseller lists, because her book, and you could read it and make your own judgments, but it gives people who are dying to know, like, what do I do? How do I recognize this? She gives them a path. And I would say to people, read that book, listen to my podcast if you want a digest version of it. But sort of going back to the apology thing, at the end of the podcast, I asked Robin DiAngelo a question, and I think it was a question about white liberals, because, from my experience, white liberals are the worst. But she, she answers, and then she said something that I did not anticipate. She said, and Jonathan, I'm going to look you in the eye right now, and I am going to say to you, on behalf of my people, I'm sorry. I couldn't get through the outro without breaking down in tears. And it goes back to what I said before, that we are so, as African Americans, are so used to not having the pain and the hurt acknowledged, that when someone, and I think I cried also because the sincerity in her voice just hit me. It just hit me in that spot where I was like, oh my, she means this. This is real. Also, I'm a little raw and tender right now. But it all conspired and worked in a way where it was that cathartic release that I needed. And I think that is the same cathartic release that the nation needs, and I think is going through right now.
It's so interesting, because I think even about my journey and NGLCC's journey in general. We realized a couple of years ago that we had much work to do in this space. We had a business owner who came to me and said, as a gay Black man, I don't always feel comfortable at NGLCC. And as a Black gay man, I don't always feel comfortable at NMSDC, the National Minority Supplier Development Council. So our organizations, myself and the leader over there, sort of put our heads together. So this can't be. We have so many shared stakeholders, and there are so many people that are business owners that fit into both of our organizations, that we really have to do something. So we've been very intentional about it, and very intentional about programming, and consistent, and doing things in advance of George Floyd, because we needed to be, and we'll continue to do things because we need to be. But I think part of it is also just understanding that just because we've said it, or just because we're doing it, it doesn't mean that everyone's going to suddenly say, okay, great, no more problems then. We trust you implicitly or explicitly. There's no problem here. Let's all go on and happily march down the street together. And I think that's something that is frustrating to others, that it can't just be great because we want it to be great now because we've tried. And it has to be a continued, every single day sort of thing, which sort of leads me to the point that you'd mentioned about, it's great to be doing it while the camera's on, but the cameras will go off. They'll move on to something else. and the issue has not been solved. What is it? I mean, talk to me as maybe a black man here, not as a, or black journalist, however you want to talk to me, but look at it through the lens of, is there a level of frustration with the person that shows up to snap the picture, to post the day on Facebook, that's the armchair activist, and as soon as the next issue comes up, they're championing this, and then they're championing that, and it's just sort of whatever's the cause du jour is where my attention is.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah. Well, I mean, those are the worst sort of, you know, paying tourists. I don't know how else to describe it. You know, that's when, and I think you saw a lot of it, particularly on you know, African Americans on Twitter and on social media, who are all like, "Hey, this is great. Glad you're here. Welcome.
Yeah.
We're gonna check back in about a month to see if you're still here." And sure enough, I started seeing things, particularly on Instagram, that said, you know, this is still going on. A month after you put that black square up on your Instagram feed, we're still here. Like, this is still going on. Breonna Taylor's, the officers who killed her have still not been arrested. There is work to do. And so, you know, everyone needs to understand, like, I'll go back to the lawn analogy I used a moment ago. When it comes to fighting hate and bigotry, and particularly anti-Blackness, it is like tending a lawn that, you know, you mow it and it grows over a couple of hours later, and you have to keep working at it. I mean, you're right. Folks want to, like, get out there, march, protest, and then go to brunch and think that, you know, I've done my part, and, you know, I'm going to move on to something else. And that is not how this works. And I hope that, given who we have in the White House now, and the election that we're about to have, and the consciousness that has been raised, that people understand that everything from anti-Blackness to our democracy requires vigilance. That's the word actually I've been looking for, is vigilance. If you really do care about the things you say you care about equality and fairness and justice, then you have to ask yourself every day, what am I doing, or what have I done? What am I doing? And what am I going to do in my own way to ensure that I've done something to advance that? Because if we each do that, if we each do that in our own small way, imagine, what is it, 350 million Americans slice off that 30%, hardcore 30% for President Trump. But I do think that most people are good, decent people who want to do the right thing. So imagine if that many people did one small thing in their own way to make things better, how much better things would be.
Well, it's a great sort of segue to the question I was going to ask you, to put on your prognosticator cap here. And what is the prognosis for the continued march, and how reliant is it upon a change in the White House?
Oh, it is totally reliant on a change in the White House. Look, I think I go back to June 26th, 2015, which to me is the high water mark of who we are as a country. And I don't know if people remember what happened that day. At 10 a.m., the Supreme Court announced that marriage equality was legal, that same-sex couples could get married. 10 a.m., the President of the United States went into the Rose Garden and heralded that decision. 2 o'clock that afternoon, the President of the United States, and I should point out, the first Black president of the United States, is then in Charleston, South Carolina, eulogizing a friend who was one of the Mother Emanuel 9, who was murdered by a white supremacist in their church in Charleston. Famous African-American church, Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina. And in a eulogy that will go down as one of the best non-political political speeches ever, where the president of the United States starts singing Amazing Grace. And I remember watching, just sort of slack-jawed. I was already an emotional wreck from earlier in the day, having marriage equality become law of the land, but now watching a Black president be unapologetically Black while eulogizing 9 Black people who were murdered by a white supremacist, and with white supremacy being woven into the DNA of this nation and as a part of our original sin, and eulogizing them and calling us to not only our better angels, but to live up to the ideals in our founding documents. It was breathtaking. But even that wasn't the end of it, because that night, anyone here in Washington, without any announcement or fanfare, the White House, as the sun went down, suddenly glowed with the rainbow colors. I'm getting choked up thinking about it now. We were never more free, fair, and just than we were on that day, and especially after 7 p.m. that night. But what we didn't understand or paid too much attention to was that 10 days earlier, Donald Trump came down that escalator and announced his candidacy for president of the United States. And within 2 minutes of his speaking was when he said that Mexicans were rapists. And that was the signal of a revolution that was already happening. And I bring all that history up because I do think a lot of people thought, because of what happened that day, and because of the president that we had, and because of the expectations we had of him, but also the expectations that he allowed us to have. Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and there was no question that the Justice Department was going to go and investigate what happened. Fast forward to today. In that election, we now know that who sits in the Oval Office truly matters, because we went from a man of intelligence and decency with a moral core and a sense of justice and fairness to the exact opposite, to a president who turned troops, federal officers on American people peacefully protesting across from the White House. And so I say all that to say, yes, it absolutely does matter who is in the Oval Office, and that we shouldn't raise all that, because it's another example of how you cannot take anything for granted. We took it for granted that the trajectory that we were on was always towards, more fair, more just, and that it wouldn't be possible for this guy to get elected. He's so retrograde, he's so backwards, he's so regressive. And now look where we are. And so if anyone truly cares about, who we could be as a nation, or just trying to go back to a time when the president of the United States was an avatar as best that person could be for all of us, and not just a hardcore, hateful 30% who would like nothing more than to have the rest of us go away, disappear, or be subservient to their retrograde beliefs. My hope is that come November, we will have a new administration, that we will have a Biden-Harris administration. But I implore folks who are watching, the polls are great now. I believe the polls right now. Remember, polls are snapshots in time. Hillary Clinton was way ahead 4 years ago this time. This race is going to narrow. Do not get comfortable. the wide leads that Biden has now in those polls, both nationally and in the battleground states, will not last. Once the convention's over and we get into Labor Day, those polls are going to narrow. And the other thing that I'm watchful for, again, because we're dealing with a man who not only has no moral core and no convictions, we're also dealing with a person who will do anything to win. And then you throw on top of it that as long as he's president of the United States, he can't be prosecuted by federal authorities up in the Southern District of New York. So he has every incentive to do everything possible to remain president of the United States. And that is something that everyone should keep in the backs of their minds when the next crazy thing he says or does happens. It might seem crazy and unhinged, and it probably will be, but there is a concrete reason and goal for doing it.
I'm going to turn it over here in just a minute to Alicia and Sean for take some audience questions. I've been watching the feed here though, and there's a lot of folks that have asked if you would give that reading list once again. So before I turn over to Sean and Alicia for a couple of questions, and then I have a couple of closing questions, could you give us that reading list once again?
Sure. And so this is the order I read them, and I think this is a good order to read them. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. That sort of gives you sort of like what is institutional racism and how do white people factor into it and how they use it and don't use it depending on the situations that they're in. Then the next book is White Rage by Carol Anderson. Carol Anderson is an African-American women professor who wrote this book, and the White Rage is white fragility in action over history. So she takes you through slavery, then to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and then through to Obama, basically making the argument that for every advancement African Americans have made, there has been an overwhelming backlash. So slavery became Reconstruction, which then became the rise of the Jim Crow era in the South. You know, Brown v. Board of Education soon turned into the craziness, you know, anti-busing and things like that. And then Barack Obama leading to the election of Donald Trump. And then the third book is Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl. And he basically takes those two books and then shows how they come into play in modern day, right now, America. So, and does it through policy. So in Missouri, it's about gun legislation. In Kansas, it is about school funding. And then in Tennessee, it is about healthcare and the expansion of Medicare through Obamacare. And how white people, because they don't want to give any benefit to non-white people, will literally vote against their interests. And the book opens with the story of this man named Trevor in Tennessee on oxygen, dying. And the conversation was all about Obamacare. And he said he didn't want his tax dollars going to Obamacare. Besides, it's only going to go to Mexicans and welfare queens. This is a man who, if Medicare had been expanded in Tennessee, would have been able to get the health care he needed to save his life. And yet he didn't want to do it because it meant providing resources to everyone. And that everyone included people of color.
So White Fragility, White Rage, Dying of Whiteness. Those are the three recommendations from Jonathan Capehart for your remaining must-read summer reading. Take a minute here, and if you have a question, please put it in the chat box. I'm going to turn it over to Alicia and Sean to take us through any audience questions we may have. Sean, you want to start us out?
Sure, I'll go ahead and start. Hello, great conversation with you, Jonathan. I appreciate everything you said, everything you've done for just everything.
Thank you.
The question we have, and I'll start off with this one. It's the hate is real and strong, and now we must address and educate Karens. How do you approach the Karens in our world?
Oh, So I noticed early on, I remember sending a text message to a friend of mine, Black woman, also in television. I'm not naming names. And I sent her this thing and I said, why is it always a white woman who is doing this stuff? Like yelling at people and asking questions and who are you? And I think, and I have not had a Karen situation, I have not. But having seen all the examples, I'm ready. And I think the rest of us are ready, because it's like when you are comfortable in your own skin and you know you are in the right and you're videotaping, I mean, the example I'm thinking of is the woman, was it in San Francisco? She was out with her husband and the guy was writing on chalk on his own wall, Black Lives Matter. And she comes up to him and asks, what are you doing? Do you live here? And he said, yeah, I live here. I'm doing my thing. I don't think you live here. And then she does this whole, well, I'm very good friends with the people who live here. It's like, well, please call the police. Call the police. Do it right now. And then they had to scurry off when they were proven wrong. So I don't have any practical how to deal with Karen's situations. All I would say is if you find yourself in a position where you're dealing with a Karen, first, consider your safety and whether it's worth it to even engage. But if it is worth it to engage, stand your ground. If anything I've learned is to stop acting like we do not have a right to be here and allowing other people to treat us that way. I mean, if anything, it's like, lady friend, were it not for my ancestors and the ancestors of all the other Black people you're looking around here, where would you be? Yeah, we should all just sort of carry around copies of 1619 Project and just hand out. Nicole Hannah-Jones's opening essay is just thousands of words of brilliance, and just hand it to here, read this to understand why I don't have time for you right now. I'll leave it at that.
I get it. Thank you. Alicia.
Yes, no, thank you for that. And as you were speaking, somebody brought up the example about the incident that happened in Central Park.
Yes. Oh, that's right, because that happened the same day as George Floyd.
Yeah.
And earlier in the day, and Christian Cooper. And talk about somebody who was standing his own ground. He knew exactly, wait, you're coming for me? And the thing that made Amy Cooper like the queen of the Karens is because she flat out said, I'm gonna call the cops and say that there's an African-American man threatening me. I mean, that's everything we've been talking about rolled up into one scene, one incident. She knew exactly what that would do. Just saying those words, which she did, to the police, the result, the action that could have happened if the cops had gotten there. Like, she put his life in danger by saying that. And then the other thing she did, and I get into this with Robin DiAngelo in my podcast, when she realized that it wasn't working with the cops, the tenor and tone of what she's saying amps up. she starts shrieking and starts crying and doing all that stuff to try to elicit the kind of attention that she had been raised to expect. And I think that the beauty of what Christian Cooper did was get it on video, and then, I mean, we can quibble over whether he should have helped the police investigate her, but the consequences of her actions 5 years ago, I don't think would have happened at all. In fact, no one would have believed Christian Cooper. But today, because of cameras, but also because of a raised awareness, we all know what she was doing, and she was held accountable for it. And I am not sad about it. But anyway, Alicia, I stopped you the moment you said, sorry. Go ahead.
Perfectly fine. So let's go back to, now we have, Joe Biden has formally picked Kamala Harris as his VP. So Madam, Vice President Kamala, do you think her being a prosecutor, her past as a prosecutor, will be a concern for the Black voters?
I'm sure for some Black voters it will be a concern, and that's not to say that the questions shouldn't be asked. The African American community's relationship with prosecutors has not been a good one, but we also have to be careful when reading stories about her record as San Francisco DA and her record as a California Attorney General, that we have to be mindful of the times that she was in. Like, it's great that we're all conscious and woke right now in the way we're thinking of things, but it's a mistake to think that that's where the country was when she was in that office, or where the country was when Joe Biden and a whole bunch of Black Democrats voted for the 93 crime bill. There was a reason those things happened. But also, when you read Kamala Harris's book, right here on my bookcase, she talks about why she became a prosecutor. Remember, folks who are trying to rip on Kamala Harris because she became a prosecutor don't know that she comes from a civil rights background, that her mother and father met at civil rights marches in Berkeley, and that they brought her along, and that is the environment she grew up in. She came to Washington and went to Howard. So anyone who's out there saying, well, Kamala's a cop and she put people in jail, and you ask her and she says, well, you know what? We need to have people who look like us on the other side of the table who are making decisions about us. And that we also can't lose the sight of the fact that Black people are harmed by people who should be put in jail and held accountable. And that was the way she saw her role. So I'm all fine for people asking questions about her record on criminal justice, and where she was then and why she did or didn't do what they thought she should do. But I also think that they should fast forward and say, okay, well, where is she now? And what does she plan to do? And one other thing, everyone keeps talking about, well, she put parents in jail because they didn't send their kids to school. Not true. And I'm gonna write a column about that.
Thank you for that, Jonathan. Sean, you have a question?
I do, and this is, I think you did touch a little bit on this with your discussion with Justin, and it's also a continuation on the Biden-Harris ticket. The question is, I'd love to hear Jonathan's take on intersectionality and if it has impacted him as a Black gay man, and what, if anything, this Biden-Harris ticket can do to address intersectional oppression.
Wow. Well, I mean, in the job that I have as an opinion writer and as a journalist, I actually get to say what I think about things. And also as an opinion writer who's on the editorial board, bringing my whole self to conversations. And so, I come to the conversation as a Black man, or when it came to marriage equality, I came at it as a gay man, as a member of the LGBTQ community. I think the beauty of the Black Lives Matter movement that I don't think a lot of people appreciate is a lot of the leaders are LGBTQ people. And folks have been trying to get the gay community to understand, you know, we're not just about marriage. There are gay people who are in DACA, who are DACA. There are gay people who are African American and are worried about being stopped by the cops. There are gay people who can't get health care, who can't vote. I think, if anything, right now, there's a heightened awareness of a lot of things. And I think more of an awareness of the fact that while we might identify in certain ways, there are issues that hit us in numerous ways, and that it would behoove us, particularly those of us who care about equality, fairness, and justice, to understand that one piece of one's identity could come into play someplace else, and how you as an ally should be out there marching and helping folks who, let's say, you are Latina and DACA and LGBTQ, and and I'm putting you in there, Justin. What are you, Justin, doing as a member of the LGBTQ community to help folks who are part of DACA or worried about immigration reform, or coming up with a comprehensive immigration plan that finally brings citizenship to the undocumented in the United States? We all have to understand that, you know, we are a bundle of identities, and the more we put them to work to knit them all together, the better we will be. I think in terms of the election, there's no question that we would be a better nation with Biden and Harris in the White House than with Trump and Pence, certainly for another 4 years. That if Biden and Harris win, that's one victory, and the inauguration parties and stuff will be great. But come January 21st, the hard work begins. And I would implore people who are, you know, looking for results from a Biden-Harris administration to understand that there are going to be fits and starts and competing interests and everything, but to know and to appreciate that in Biden and certainly in Harris, who is intersectionality in one person. Her mom was Indian, her dad's Jamaican, she identifies as Black. She's the first Black woman, first South Asian woman to be put in this perch. Former prosecutor, she brings so much intersectionality to the table that I don't think we quite know yet how she's going to work that, and two, just how powerfully she'll be able to achieve or help Biden achieve some of the goals. I keep looking over here because the Biden-Harris event is about to start, and the SUVs have arrived. That this is your live report, literal live report.
Well, that might be a good opportunity for us to wind down our conversation. Then thank you so much to Sean and Alicia for taking us through some of the questions there. Just one other that I saw in there that I thought was really time appropriate. And I have one final question for you. But
that's fine. We've got time.
What else can we do? It says for allies. You mentioned the reading list. You mentioned 1619. What other resources are there that the Black community can share with their allies, with your allies, with me and my colleagues, to be more effective in our work to champion anti-racism and racial violence?
That's a big question, and I do not have a direct answer for you. All I would say is use the energy in this moment right now to just start. I think a lot of times people try to find, okay, what's the number one thing I can do, and then I'm there. And there is no number one thing you can do. And I think when something like institutional racism and all of this stuff that we're talking about, it's so daunting that you can paralyze yourself into inaction. And so what I would say is, crack open one of those books I talked about. Get Ibrahim Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I myself have not read, but is on my list. And start approaching it the way you did when you went to college, if you went to college, or when you were in high school, you're studying up on a subject, and now take what you've learned and turn it into action, however you can do it or however you define it. And then I go back to the way any issue is solved is through personal interaction. And so if you want to be a good ally and be an effective ally, well, be it. Go get to know people and get to know them for real. Because I don't want to speak for Sean or Alicia, but we can always tell the non-person of color or the non-Black person who is using us asking us questions as an anthropological experiment, as opposed to, hey, you're my coworker or you're my neighbor, and this is what's going on, and I am truly concerned and I want to know how to help. Do not underestimate the power of sincerity, but only do that with Black people you actually have some kind of relationship with. I'm not one of those people who got random texts from people I hadn't heard from in years. It's like, hey, I hope you're okay. No. People want to know, or I should say, Black people want to know that the people who they see every day, who they think don't see them, actually see them.
Thank you for that. And before I ask your final question, I should come clean, I guess, a little bit, that the whole way that we were able to meet Jonathan, and he has so graciously hosted our Best of the Best. I think since all 5 years of it, you've done it. Assuming you'll come back when we do it virtually later this year. Actually, you were the next door neighbor of Chance Mitchell, my co-founder at NGLCC. So Jonathan probably has a lot of stories he could tell, and graciously has put them in the journalist lockbox. So
there are no stories to tell. Half the time I didn't even know if he was there. The walls were so thick.
Last question. Just we didn't get much of a chance to talk about Nick, which great. That's maybe more than you want to talk about anyway. I know he's a wonderful guy, and the two of you are incredibly happy, and congratulations on that. And I think coming up on your 4 years, I think January. Mm-hmm. If you could tell the Jonathan Capehart that was the young gay Black kid when you realized you were gay, when you realized it, if you could tell him some lesson that you've learned today, the Jonathan Capehart adult of today, what would it be? And I ask that because so many people in our network have come to me and said, my daughter just came out, my son just came out, I don't know what to tell them. What advice would you give? I give advice, I share my thoughts, but I know there are little gay Black kids in this country that need to hear something inspirational from you that, hopefully parents or friends of parents or colleagues on this call can go back and share with them.
Well, no one's ever asked me that question. I think, well, one of the things that's been most helpful to me was having a mom who never poured cold water on any dream that I had. And so since I was 10, I always knew I wanted to be a journalist, and to be a television journalist in particular. And I won't go through the whole stories, but I'm the only journalist in the family, the only writer in the family, the only person in TV in the family. And so here my mom has this chatty kid who is talking all about how he wants to be a news commentator at NBC. And all she could do is just say, well, that's good, honey. And if you want to do it, you can do it. No clue how to even get there. But the fact that she didn't say, well, how are you going to do that? Well, you can't do that. The number one thing I think any adult can do for a young, a child or a young person is to encourage their dreams. Especially when it's clear that it's not just the fad of the moment, but when they come to you and say, this is what I want to do, and this is who I am, to encourage that, to nurture it. Especially when it comes to gay kids, I mean, it was a little more complicated back then, but today, I think any parent of an LGBTQ kid should be open to just sitting down and letting their child or mentee or young relative, to make it clear to them. Like, we all know the kid who might be questioning, might be struggling, or clearly is, but no one's saying anything about it. The best thing we could do, the best thing you could do for that child, is to make it clear to them, either in word or just by example, that you are open and that you are there for them, and that you are someone they can come to talk to. And if you don't have the answers or you don't have the advice, take in the questions and then find someone who does. And if you are on this call, this Zoom, no matter what slice of life you're in, you are involved in an organization where you have someone you can call to at least take that first step to getting answers for that young person. The older I get, the more I realize how important it is for young people to know that they are seen, and that they are seen for who they actually are, and not who they think they should be, because that's what they see either at school or the messages that they're getting because of family dynamics. We don't have children, but we've nieces and nephews. And I am all about, okay, I'm meeting you where you are. And tell me everything. I want to hear everything. And if anything, if we do end up having kids, the one thing I will desperately try not to do is to stomp on the dreams or creativity of that child. I think if we were allowed to be that 5-year-old or be that 10-year-old again, just imagine how much more fun, interesting, free, creative, and fair the world would be.
So the newspaper is the Washington Post. The podcast is Cape Up. The cable news television station is MSNBC. The award is a Pulitzer Prize. And the man is my friend and the amazing journalist Jonathan Capehart. Thank you so much for being our inaugural guest on our Crossroads and Conversations. It is much appreciated. You are a good friend and inspirational leader, someone that I have a great deal of respect for, and your work speaks for itself. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Justin. Thank you. It was great.
And thank you to our sponsors for today's event. I'd like to give a big shout out to Accenture, AT&T, EY, Shell, and Verizon for helping us produce today's inaugural event. Please stay tuned for upcoming Crossroads and Conversations. We'll be doing this once a month, again, talking with corporate leaders, newsmakers, breakthrough suppliers, all kinds of great topics and great speakers. Join us on Friday for another edition of NGLCC Sip and Pitch from 3 to 6. And with that being said, I want to give a big thank you to the team at NGLCC who always makes these productions interesting, fun, and run on time. And I am a little bit over. I will take responsibility for that. And I want to thank all of you that were able to tune in from the NGLCC Stakeholder Network to join us for today's event. Thank you all very much. And we're looking forward to continuing our advocacy. We might not always get it right, but we're going to work our best to get it right, to make it right, and to stand up for the things that each and every one of us believes in. And among those are equality and equity for everyone. So thank you all very much. Have a good rest of your day.